Good evening, gentlemen. We have a very exciting class in store tonight. We are continuing, we are in the middle of studying chapter 1 of Tanya, Tanya. We are in the middle. We started and asked many questions, and today the questions only continue. It'll probably be only next week that we really start the long process of answering all of our questions. We discussed last week the 5 levels, the 5 different types or categories of Jew that we derive from the Gemara, from the Talmud. You have the righteous and it's good to him, the righteous and it's bad to him, the wicked it's good to him, the wicked it's bad to him, and the Beinoni, the intermediate man. And we begin to grapple with the definitions of these categories. What do these categories mean? And we quickly discovered, last week's class, that the Alter Rebbe's intention is to demonstrate that these categories cannot be simply defined or simply understood. These are categories not based on external definition. In other words, you cannot simply judge which of these categories a person is in based on their behavior, based on their external behavior. Rather, these categories reflect an inner state of being, as the Zohar immediately clued us onto, that you have a tzaddik and it's wicked to him means tzaddik and it's bad for him doesn't refer to a righteous person who suffers. It doesn't refer to a righteous person suffering in this world, which is what you would think from the simple level of the Gemara it means. Rather, what you think is that rather what it means, as it says in the Zohar, is that a righteous person is only informed by the voice of righteousness. The inner inclination towards doing good is the only voice that speaks to him. The wicked is judged by his evil inclination. It's only the inner voice of evil or negativity that speaks to him. And the Beinoni both speak to him. The Beinoni is in the middle category. In other words, the tzaddik and it's good for him is a tzaddik who has only good. The tzaddik who it's bad for him is a tzaddik where there's a little bit of bad, but it's contained. It doesn't have any effect on him. The Beinoni is an intermediate. He seems to have both. The wicked and it's good for him is mainly wicked, but he has some good within him. The wicked and it's bad for him doesn't have any good within him to affect him. This was basically how we began to, from our sources, to unpack what these categories seem to mean, but without any real detail or any real unpacking of what these categories seem to describe. At the end of last week's class, we read the statement of Rabbah, that Rabbah famously said, I am a Beinoni. Rabbah said, an example of a Beinoni who's an intermediate man, said the great sage Rabbah, he said, I'm an intermediate man. And Abaye immediately said to Rabbah, that if you are an intermediate man, you don't leave room for anyone else to live, which could be interpreted multiple ways. It could mean that if you're a Beinoni, no one else has a hope to be a tzaddik, or if you're only a Beinoni, an intermediate person, that means the world doesn't have a tzaddik yesod elam, the world doesn't have a foundation, it doesn't have a leg to stand on because the world is upheld by the righteous, and if you're intermediate, then surely no one's righteous, and the whole world is going to be unmade, the whole world's going to fall apart. And so we basically left last week's class with a bunch of these sources, and without really resolving any of the contradictory information or different sources or the different definitions of what the 5 different categories are, we didn't really resolve any of those issues. Those issues were just brought up by the Tanya mostly. And this week we're going to continue to try and make sense of these 5 categories. And of course, the Alter Rebbe's goal in all of this, what the Alter Rebbe aims at in this whole process, is for an inner understanding, for an inner, a pnimius dika, as we would say in Yiddish, a more inward-facing understanding of the person's reality, which is really what's being introduced here in the first half of the first chapter of Tanya. What do we mean when we say that the Tanya is aiming at an inner reality, as opposed to a superficial or external reality? So we've touched on this in previous classes, but I think it's important to keep it we need to buoy it along in our classes, because when we get to the second half of chapter 1, we're going to expand on this greatly. So let's touch on it again tonight. What do we mean when we say that the Alter Rebbe's whole focus is to understand the inner reality, right, rather than the outer reality? Again, as mentioned in many of the previous classes, the truth is that the Alter Rebbe is a radical. The Alter Rebbe is not coming to suggest minor changes to the way that the person looks at the world. The Alter Rebbe is coming to rewrite how a person looks at the world completely, 100% top to bottom rearrangement of how a person looks at reality. The average person assumes that the outer reality of things is what's real. The reason people assume that, there's actually many, it's quite complicated actually. One of the reasons that people assume that is because the outer reality is the shared reality, right? So for example, I'll use a very simple example, which is really almost so empty as to be laughable, but sometimes the simplest examples are the easiest to understand, and then you can extrapolate from there, right? Let's say your mother makes the world's best chicken soup, which in my case happens to be true. I don't know about anyone else's mother. So everybody else has a mother also. But in my case, right, this is very much connected to the whole lesson we're trying to teach here, of course. It adds a bit of salt or flavor to the lesson we're trying to teach here, let's put it that way. You say, my mother has the best chicken soup in the world, right? That chicken soup has been experienced by, depending on how many guests you have, right, let's say 50 people on the face of the planet, or whatever it is, right? Versus, let's say, what's a good example? Let's use something inert so as not to upset anyone. Let's say there's a migrant crisis on the border of Belarus and Poland. Right, that's in the news. I heard that there's a whole conflict going on the border between Belarus and Poland. These are places in Europe. For any American, there's no real. We have one American in attendance actually, but it's It's making fun of Americans for only knowing what's in America. You have to, right? Of course. L'chaim. That is something that thousands of people in the world know. Thousands of people know that fact, maybe millions, that there's a border crisis on the border between Belarus and Poland. As opposed to your mother's chicken soup, only a few people know. Why am I making this stupid comparison? Because there is a way of thinking, and it's rarely so direct that you could catch it in the following words, which again are an oversimplification, right? But there's a way of thinking which says that the more people know something, right, the more consensus there is, right, the realer it is, right? So your mother's best chicken soup I don't care how good it is. Only a handful of people can even know how good it is, because only a handful of people have ever tasted it, right? Whereas the number of people that know for a fact that there's a migrant crisis on the border of Belarus and Poland, millions of people know. So that makes it more real, because more people know there's more of a consensus. Now, in a more subtle way, this works on the individual level as well. So for example, a person has to do their job or they won't get paid. Or no, even better, a person needs money to buy groceries. Let's make it even simpler, right? Versus a person realizes that there is a creator and a power that creates this universe and sustains it and rules over it, right? One of these is a fact that finds much more consensus, even though they're both in the person's life, right? These are both things in one person's life. One person has two things in their life. They know that they have to pay money for groceries, earn money to buy groceries. And the second fact is they know that there's a reality of God, right? One of these has more consensus. The more people participate, it's more of a shared knowledge, right? And that one is that a person has to make money to get groceries within that person's life, right? The person's knowledge of God, as I think should be obvious to anyone hearing it, is a much more private and deeper and inner matter than the matter of needing money to buy groceries, which is a much more external, pragmatic, if you will, connected to, it seems, more issues in the external world, such as where I'll live and how I'll arrange my life and whether I'll go to the grocery store today, right? And how I'll behave at work. All of these things are affected by this fact. It's more, it has more consensus. There's more things in my experience that seem on the surface to contribute to the grocery fact than the existence of God fact. Yes? There is such a thing as an outer world, and there's such a thing as an inner world. Now, there's different ways you can define them. I'm just giving you one, and it's a very ephemeral one. Maybe we'll do more as we go. There's other ways you can frame this that make it seem much more solid, but I like this one because to me, it seems personal and what's the word? Directly knowable in a sense, right? Something that's very apparent, right? What's very apparent is that there's two different ways you can look at the world. You could say, if something is shared and has more consensus and has more pragmatic effect, defined in a certain way, defined as interacts with other things externally in the external world, right? Like the fact that I have to pay money for groceries has effects on my work and where I live, and if I'm going to the grocery store, right? It has more, it's chained into many, many things, right? Automatically by its very nature. Or I could say that the thing which is deepest in me, the thing which is deepest in my inner reality, right, is really more real. It's more real that I know that there is a creator, even though it's something that I can't even express
more real?
In the way, yes. Even though it's something that, one second, I'll hear your question in just 1 second. Even though it's something that's more, that can't be expressed, and that doesn't necessarily change. It's a fact that doesn't change how I behave at work today, maybe. Or it doesn't change, at least on the surface, not by its very form. It doesn't change whether I'm going to the grocery store today. And yet, this inner reality, which I know most profoundly, most basically, in the inner wenigsten Ich, as the Rebbe says in Yiddish, in the innermost I, the innermost self, right? That's more real than the external reality. Right? I mentioned in a previous class that in a different way of looking at this, a more philosophical way, you could say that the whole world today, in the materialist scientific perspective, says that the real reality is the external reality, right? Everything is just matter and how matter interacts. And the fact that we even seem to have an inner reality is just more matter and matter interacting, right? Chassidus takes a radically different view. Chassidus says the inner reality is what I accept axiomatically. The inner reality is what I accept as more real. The outer reality, where there's matter interacting and things hitting each other and laws of nature and neurons firing in the brain, that's all just one aspect or one reflection of the inner reality, right? You see how it's the opposite, right? Which one is within which? The basic, one opinion says the basic reality is external, and the inner reality is just one bizarre, exceptional area of the outer reality. But the outer reality is what's real, right? To learn Chassidus, to begin to appreciate Tanya, it helps a lot. I don't say you have to be able to. It helps a lot to be able to make this switch, to turn it the opposite. The way the Alter Rebbe is talking is that the inner reality, and really, in a sense, the first half of the first chapter of Tanya is building to this. It's not building to it philosophically, it's building to it textually, right? The Alter Rebbe is saying the external reality, right? In other words, tzaddik is as tzaddik does, as Forrest Gump would say, right? That a person is defined by the behavior, right? The behaviorist approach, they would say in modern psychology, right? Where we don't care what's going on inside. It's all about the behavior, right? How does the person act? How do they respond, right? It's all stimulus response, right? And forget the internal. The internal world isn't really real in that view, right? It's all about what do I see a tzaddik doing, right? And by definition, anything you see a tzaddik doing is the external reality of the tzaddik, right? You'll never know the tzaddik from the inside, judging by what he's doing. The Alter Rebbe rejects, and his point is really to show that the Torah in the first place couldn't have possibly been speaking about this from all of these textual proofs and sources that we're bringing. He's trying to demonstrate that if you read the sources in the Torah as meaning that, you'll never be able to untangle all of these contradictions. The only way you can untangle all of these contradictions about what it says that a tzaddik is, and a rasha is, and a Beinoni, right? These states that the person has, these inner states, or these states of being that a person has, of righteous and wicked and in between, all the 5 levels, the only way you're going to be able to untangle it is if you realize that the inner reality of the thing, its nefesh, its soul, dare we say, as we'll say in the second half of the chapter, right? And we'll define what that word means, nefesh, and what we mean by soul. We'll try and dig into that when we get to it. This is just, I'm mentioning all of this now just so when we get to that, we sort of have this momentum, if you understand what I'm saying. Because if you don't mention it for a few weeks, you sort of forget, right? So I'm trying to maintain this thread as we go forward, right? That it helps so much to understand that's what the Alter Rebbe is doing. The Alter Rebbe is making this switch. We don't start from assuming that the outer reality is real and the inner reality is just nested within the outer reality. Or to speak even more plainly, we don't assume that your soul is one thing that exists in a broader universe, and that universe is what's real, and your soul is in the universe. On the contrary, we are going to start with the soul. We're going to say the soul is what's real, right? And the external universe is all for the purposes of the expression of that soul. And when we say soul, in a sense, we mean also God, because as we're going to see, the soul, at least the godly soul, is a piece of God, right? So in other words, there's God above, so to speak, God himself. We're going to see there's a piece of God below. There's also something called the animal soul, which is similar. We'll discuss the similarities and differences, which is similar in many ways. You have God above, you have the soul, and everything that is between your innermost self and the creator of heaven and earth. As you get further away from either one of those poles, you come into the less real part of reality. Right? The realist reality is in the deepest self of the Jew and the creator of heaven and earth, the unchanging, the eternal one, God. That's the realist reality. As you get further away from these two things, which are actually one thing, that's the chap of the second chapter of Tanya, because the soul is a piece of God, whatever that means, right? As you get away from these two things, let's not say they're one thing, let's say they're united profoundly, and we'll get to what that means, right? As you get away from these two sides and you come to this middle area where you have things like books and cell phones and other people as they appear from the outside, you have to think a bit differently, right? Because even though they have a neshama, their neshama is an inside itself, and all the neshamas are united. There's a whole way of thinking that goes into this, right? But you come into a world, let's speak without people, because people complicate things. You speak without the world of cell phones and books and elephants and cars and trees. That world, which is somewhere in the middle between the soul and God, the two fundamental selves that are really one self, that external world, that's all superficial. That's all not really real. That's all just the means of either of these two things to express themselves, to communicate, to cross over. It's like a bridge between the two sides. But this middle ground is not the basis of reality. So you've basically taken, it's hard, I think visually sometimes, so it's a bit hard to describe. If I could draw it would help a lot, right? You've taken a universe that was round like this, and the Alter Rebbe wants you to invert it like this, right? If you understand what I'm saying. Everything that seems to be surrounding is actually not surrounding. Everything that seems to be the edges of reality, right? Which we think, when we think physically, we think the edge of the infinite universe extending outwards and all the stars and all the planets, right? For example, I mean, very simply, everything, what we consider the edges of the universe is really just the most minor physical reality, and it's not as real as your experience of your mother's chicken soup. Really, is the truth. So everything that seems to be surrounding is actually, in the Alter Rebbe's world, on the inside. The surrounding is the soul and God. The soul and God is the ground of reality. It's the canvas on which reality is written. Everything else, the outer world, is all in between, is all on the inside. It's not the ultimate ground. It's not the ultimate truth. This is what we mean when we say that the whole focus, the whole goal of the Alter Rebbe is to focus inner, is to focus on the pnimius, right? It's a total reversal of our way of looking at reality, right? The Alter Rebbe is saying, and we're going, when we get into the souls, which is the second half of the first chapter and the second chapter of Tanya, when we start talking about the souls, this quickly becomes very apparent, or it becomes apparent in terms of what's missing. Right. In other words, and this maybe we'll discuss this more later as well, because I'm really sort of rambling on about this. But in other words, I'll just say this quickly, and then we'll talk to Ronnie, and then we'll get into class. Yeah. So in other words, if you come to someone, if someone comes to you, if you're in someone's lecture and they say, or you're reading someone's book, and they say, I'm going to explain all of reality to you, right? Everything you need to know to fulfill your entire purpose in this reality, right? And then they don't tell you anything at all about anything that seems real, right? They don't talk about trees. They don't talk about human history. They don't talk about the scientific method. They don't talk about the analysis of the material world. They don't even really talk about philosophical process, right? They don't talk about epistemology. How do you know what's real? How do you not know what's real, right? The Alter Rebbe comes to you and he starts talking to you about what? He starts talking to you about nefesh. Nefesh is the basis. What's chapter 1? What's the most basic thing you need to know? Is nefesh, is soul. Soul is the basis. Soul is, with soul, the two souls, as the Alter Rebbe is going to explain. The Nefesh Abam is the animal soul in chapter 1, and we'll have to discuss why it's in this order. The animal soul in chapter 1, and then the godly soul in chapter 2. with these realities, right, and the reality of God, which is taken as axiomatic and a given, and which is discussed more in the second chapter of Tanya, but also in the second part of Tanya, but also in the part of Tanya we're studying, of course. With these realities, the Alter Rebbe builds everything in life. But it's all backwards. The things that we think are the most real and the most important, their correct place, according to the Alter Rebbe, is as a footnote, right? That's one aspect of the real reality, because it's all backwards. The things that you think are biggest, right, are really just one means to accomplish what's really real, which is your inner world, your inner purpose, your inner connection with God, love and fear of God, right? So, as we've summarized the whole purpose of Tanya, someone comes to the Alter Rebbe and they say, I keep all of Torah and mitzvahs, I study, I learn, I have a general grasp of what's required of a Jew, and I do my best to fulfill all of that, and yet something's missing. Where's God? Where's my love and fear? Why is this not transforming me as a person? Why does it not seem why does it not seem that loving and fearing God and in a way that's totally transformative is something that's possible and real? Alter Rebbe says the first thing you have to understand is that you have to invert your reality. You have to put what seems to be small and inside as the baseline, as the most real thing of the reality. The realest thing is the soul and God. That's what's real. Everything else, you'll see, you'll only be able to put your life in the right order, that you can have love and fear of God when you demote a lot of the things that you think are real to not as real, and you promote some of the things that you think are small or inconsequential or not important, and you promote them to the greatest and highest of all realities. And of course, in the process of explaining this, the Alter Rebbe explains how you got so messed up. How did you get so turned around? And it's because you have an animal side which sees everything exactly the opposite of how it is, right? And that's really the issue. As we're going to see, the one thing that the animal soul doesn't do by nature is this inversion. It's the exact opposite of what the animal soul wants to do. The animal soul wants to say that the external reality of each thing is the true reality of it, because that's all the animal soul is, as we'll see, right? The animal soul has got it all, by nature, has got it all backwards. Once you sort it out and you fix it, everything...
Not according to it.
Well, yes, naturally. But the good news is that by dragging it to the Alter Rebbe, you already have the upper hand, right? It's already all over, right? In other words, you're already in a good position. The fact that you're here and you're learning Tanya, right? So in other words, if you already thought that according to it was the most important thing in the world, how did you even end up here, right? And now that you're here, clearly it can't be entirely true. If you were there's a famous story of the Tzemach Tzedek. I forget all of the details, unfortunately, but the bottom line is that Tzemach Tzedek was talking about how there's such a thing as someone asked him the question, like, how do we know that this isn't all just like a dream and not real, right? The Tzemach Tzedek told him, fool, if this wasn't real, would I be here? Which is a story that can keep you up at night. It's got lots of, once you start thinking about it, it gets a little crazy, but that was the Tzemach Tzedek's answer, right? If this really wasn't real, would I be here? I wouldn't be somewhere that wasn't real. That's what the Tzemach Tzedek told him. Anyway. If I'm probably ruining the whole story. But anyway, that's the gist. Let us read some more Tanya. So that's my words that keep this theme going. Next week, God, the plan is this week we get to the end of the Alter Rebbe's questions about Tzaddik, Rasha, and Beinoni. Next week, God willing, we start learning about the Nefesh HaBahamis, and when we start learning about Nefesh HaBahamis, we'll try and find all of these ideas within the text, right, within the words of the Alter Rebbe, and bring them out, so we can attach all of these ideas, which are now just floating, with the language, the Lashon HaZav, the golden tongue, the beautiful pen of the Alter Rebbe.
To summarize,
yes.
we have two kinds of realities.
Yeah.
One is real, one is less real. The real is concealed, and the not so real is obvious.
It depends.
On who's looking.
Yeah, maybe. It depends. I'm hesitant to use those words because it really all depends. What's concealed and what's revealed, right? Concealed and revealed depends on whose perspective you're looking from, right? The truth is, it's not so. The truth is that really, really, we know that the Pnimius is more real. I think a human being really does know that the Pnimius is more real. The problem is that the Nefesh HaBahamis isn't free to just know things because it has emotions.
So what is less real?
For now, the truth is that there's hundreds and hundreds of pages in Chassidus about more real and less real, and I'm using the terms very non-rigorously in English. But for now, let's use the very simple mashal, right? Let's use the mashal of the sun and its light. It's a classic mashal in Chassidus, right? You could really say for the same price, for our simple purposes, the person and their shadow works the same way, right? When it comes to the sun and its light, or the person and their shadow, for our purposes, the same metaphor, really. You realize that one of these things is primary and the other is secondary, right? Even though they're both here, right? Clearly, one is not at the same level of reality as the other. How do we know? Because one is literally dependent in every aspect on the other. It's not as baseline real. You wouldn't say the shadow is as real as the person just because the person casts the shadow. The shadow is an accidental reflection or a generated from the shape of the person when light shines on them. It's not who the person is, right? The person, the reality of the person is much more real. If you take away the person, the shadow disappears. If you take away the shadow, the person is totally unaffected, right? That's what we mean by real. Right? It's the same thing, very generally, right? There's a lot more to this, obviously. I'm saying everything very, very simple and loose, exactly, and non-rigorous. Like we're not being precise and defining all terms, and like we should, right? Because we want to do both in this class. Ideally, it's very hard to do both at the same time. We want to be rigorous and hit the point and read the words for exactly the truth that they're saying, and we also want to be in a place where we can appreciate that. And these two needs are totally opposite, totally diverging, right? So try not to be too radical in either direction.
Shalom.
That's the goal, is to make shalom. The problem is that it's difficult. It's difficult for a class that's all about the meat and potatoes and the rawest, barest truth to get at the broader picture. It's like the forest and the trees, right, basically. Right? We want both the forest and the trees. That's what we want. So I've been speaking very romantically at the level of the forest. Now, let's go study some trees. Yes? So, we are Ulahavin kol zeh. That's where we are. We are in the Hebrew, it is about halfway down. The line starts v'chulu. In the Hebrew, vav chav vav. The second word is ulahavin. About halfway down the page. In the English, to understand all the aforesaid clearly. Page 2 in the English, first new paragraph in the second column. To understand all the aforesaid clearly. That's where we are. Ulahavin calls Zeber Heitev in order to understand all of the above questions clearly. The questions being, what is a complete and incomplete tzaddik? How do we judge that tzaddik? Do we judge externally or by the essence? Do we judge him? Does a tzaddik? What do we mean by the different judges that a person has, or their different essence? In other words, really to understand what are these different levels. There is more here than meets the eye, so we need to understand this. That's one. So we finished last time one tier of questions, so to speak. V'gam lahavin masha amar Iev. Bava Basar Perak Aleph, we also have to understand what it says about what Iev said, what Job said, as explained in the Talmud, in Tractate Bava Basra 16a, where it says, Rebbeinu shel Elam, Master of the universe, Barata tzadikim, barata rashayim, you've created the righteous, you've created the wicked, chulu. Ha-tzadik v'rasha loika amar, I thought that righteous and wicked were not said. Who knows what the it's a very, very famous Gemara that it's referring to when it says righteous and wicked were not said or were not declared. Does anyone know the context? Does that ring a bell? Where the righteousness and wickedness are not declared. Maybe I'll start it and it'll start ringing a bell. It's very famous. It says that when a soul is coming down into this world, the fetus is brought before, like the is brought in heaven, and the Malach HaMamuna, which means like the appointed angel, calls out and declares what the person's fate is in many dimensions. It says whether they're going to be rich or poor. It's all predetermined.
All but that.
Yes, it's all whether they're rich or poor, whether they're strong or weak, right? It says, it declares everything about the person is all predetermined. It's all decided in advance, except whether the person is going to be righteous or wicked. That's not determined in advance. In other words, the gist being that this is where the person has free choice, right? The person doesn't get to choose whether they're going to be rich or poor. The person does, which itself is a whole, that itself requires a lot of explanation. Doesn't seem so simple, right? Especially in our society and the way we learn to think in modern day America, especially, right? The most mobile society, most upwardly mobile society on earth. So that itself requires what's the word? Delicate and refined understanding of what that means. And the truth is, I don't fully know myself. I don't fully understand. But it's all predetermined. Everything, the bottom line is the Gemara teaches us, everything is predetermined from before you're born, whether you're rich or poor, smart or not so smart, strong or weak. It's all written. It's all predetermined, except for the matter in which the human being is given true free choice. The Jew has true free choice on the matter of whether to be righteous or wicked. That's in the person's own hands. And so the angel can't declare it before you're born because it doesn't know. It doesn't know what's going to be. You get to decide what's going to be your nature in terms of goodness and wickedness, in terms of what we would call moral decision making. And of course, the whole idea of free choice and thereby righteous reward and punishment is one of the basic principles of Judaism. It's one of the Rambam's 13 principles of faith, right? That God gives the righteous their reward and the wicked their punishment, which is more or less, unless you want to get really out there philosophically, is more or less impossible to understand without the idea of free will, that the person gets to choose the righteous action or the wicked action. Otherwise, how could there be just recompense for the person's behavior? So the whole principle of Judaism, the whole pillar, one of the 13 fundamental principles of Judaism, according to Maimonides, is that the person acts well, they get rewarded for making the right decision. If they act poorly, they get punished for making the not as good decision. The most basic idea of reward and punishment depends on this very Gemara, depends on this very Talmud, which says that the righteousness and wickedness are not predetermined, because if they're predetermined, how can you really have a real reward or punishment, right? It's not the person's fault, whatever they are, right? So, it's very fundamental to Judaism that, and in fact, the Rambam also brings it to the halacha, by the way. You can look it up, the laws of repentance in the Rambam, chapter 3, law 3. It's brought in halacha and Jewish law, that God gives free choice to the individual in all matters pertaining to the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs. All matters pertaining to the fulfillment of God's will, the person is given free choice. So, this makes it all the more strange that Job says you are created righteous and you are created wicked. In other words, the exact opposite of all of this. There seems to be a strange, what would you call it? A strange, sorry?
Like a union.
A union between?
Righteous and non-righteous.
No, not righteous, and not a union between them. I think they're different. But what Job is saying is that God creates the two different things. In other words, it's not given over to the person's choice. This is something that God creates. He creates it affirmatively, apparently undermining this entire principle of Judaism. Now, of course, you might say that Job was mistaken to say this, especially because for people who have studied the book of Iyov, which of course is highly recommended, know that Job is there's a whole conversation going on over there. There's a whole argument, really, between Job and his friends, primarily, about the nature of God and the nature of reward and punishment. It's very interesting. And anyway, you could say that maybe this idea that he brought up was simply mistaken, right? In other words, it's only what we would call a hava amina, it's only what we would call a initial belief that is quickly shot down by the Torah. So maybe it's not, maybe we're trying to make a contradiction where no contradiction exists because he doesn't even really believe this to be true. Unfortunately, the Gemara itself, good evening, the Gemara itself, the Talmud itself seems to undermine this easy escape hatch. The easy escape hatch from Job is to say, oh, his opinion was mistaken, right? So if his opinion was so mistaken, the Gemara should say his opinion was mistaken. You know what the Gemara says? The Gemara says that Job's friends reply to him that yes, God creates the righteous and he creates the wicked, but for the wicked he creates barata yetzer hara ubarata tera tavlin, which comes from this Gemara. You created the evil inclination, but you created the Torah as its spice. In other words, to soften, or to, which is a very interesting language, which requires a whole other class. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting Gemara. It's interesting Gemara in general that God would create the Torah for the purpose of the evil inclination, which seems to have everything all backwards. Whatever. It's an interesting Gemara. But the bottom line is that they don't really say that Job is wrong. No one disagrees with him. This opinion, as it's brought in the Gemara, that God creates the righteous and creates the wicked, is accepted. The only argument is that, yes, but the wicked the wicked that God creates can nevertheless use the Torah to soften their wickedness. They can use the Torah to fix and to as an antidote to their wickedness that God creates. So in other words, the maskana of the Gemara in conclusion, everyone agrees, apparently, that God creates the righteous and creates the wicked, in direct contradiction to the other Gemara, which says, no one says righteousness and wicked are not declared from beforehand. So this is yet another thing that we're going to explain through the course of Tanya, and another thing that we're not going to explain yet, later, much later. As with all of these questions, we're going to answer these in a later chapter. And this all ties in with the nature, of course. Obviously, why is the Alter Rebbe bringing it up here? Because the whole idea of the righteous and the wicked, right? Once we understand the Alter Rebbe's conception of what's righteous and what's wicked, it will help us in later chapters untangle all of these issues. Alter Rebbe is going to show how if you just understand what we really mean by Rasha and Tzaddik, we can fix all of these textual difficulties and seeming contradictions.
But in essence, then,
Yeah.
depends on what's coming in future weeks.
Yeah.
If you built the Russia,
Yeah.
then what's the point in trying to do any better?
Yeah, I agree. So that's a good question. The truth is that I don't know. In other words, that seems to be what the Gemara is saying. The Gemara seems to be saying, so in other words, it's a little bit softer, because what it seems from the Gemara is that it's not really talking about ultimate fate, you could say, right? At the simple level, it seems to simply be talking about the way people are created at base is either more righteous or more wicked, right? Which means that you could still use your choice or your efforts, if you're wicked, to become not as wicked. That seems to be the implication of the Gemara. So it's not about ultimate consequences. Nevertheless, it still contradicts the other Gemara, which says that righteousness and wickedness are not pre-declared. Right? So in other words, even if we want to understand righteousness and wickedness not as an ultimate predetermined outcome that gets in the way of free will, even if you want to understand it as more of like an inclination, some people are more inclined to righteousness, where some people are more inclined to wickedness and have to work harder to be righteous, even if you understand it that way, it's still a contradiction. Because the other Gemara says the angel does not say righteous or wicked. It's not pre-declared at all. Right? Whereas here we seem to be saying that at some level, even if maybe an attenuated one, which I think is what you're saying, even if it's declared at more of an attenuated level, it's still a declaration, which is not supposed to happen. So there's still a seeming contradiction. And we're only going to resolve this contradiction by understanding the nature of Tzaddik and Rasha as the Alter Rebbe understands them, as the Alter Rebbe understands these terms.
Are there two examples
Of
that? Potentially, you could say they were Russia.
Yeah.
And then they ended up being tzaddikim.
I mean, all the time, of course.
Yeah, like Moses and David.
Sure. No, all sorts of, there's lots of movement for sure. The question is, does God create them with that nature, or did they make themselves that way? That's really the question, right? Okay, let's move on. Furthermore, Gam Lahavin, we also need to understand. So now you have a third tier of questions, which may actually be the fourth in the chapter, I forget. More questions, yet more questions. Gam Lahavin, Mahus Madregas HaBeinoni. We also have to understand what is this level of the Beinoni. So most of our questions so far have actually been about Tzaddik and Rasha, right? Now we have to understand what is this Beinoni that the Talmud describes, the middle, the intermediate man. And of course we know the Tanya is called Sefer Shel Beinonim already because it says it on the title page, right? This is a book for the intermediates. So the understanding, what does it mean, the intermediate, is very important because apparently it's us. We've already been told, right, that if it's a book for Beinonim, that means this is a book and we're reading it, the book is for us. So apparently every person has some connection to this level of the Beinoni, the intermediate man. However, as we're going to see, just like the Tzaddik and the Rasha, the sources are very difficult to understand. We have all sorts of conflicting information. How so? Certainly, the intermediate person is not someone with half merits and half sins, which is the simple, as we said last week, I believe, the simplest definition of Tzaddik, Rasha, and Beinoni is majority good deeds, majority bad deeds, or half and half. That's the simplest explanation, right? The Alter Rebbe is saying now, well, your simplest explanation is really not going to work. It's going to demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt that can't possibly be what the definition is according to the Gemara. It can't possibly be half righteous deeds and half wicked deeds. Which, first of all, whatever, I'll leave that, doesn't matter. Anyway, first, half righteous and half wicked deeds. If so, how could the great sage Rabbah make a mistake and say that he is a Beinoni? V'neda, because it's known from the Gemara elsewhere. Where is the Gemara elsewhere? The Gemara elsewhere is in Bava Metzia 86a. It says, Deloitte pasek pume megirsa, his mouth never stopped from learning Torah. His mouth was constantly learning words of Torah. To the extent that even the angel of death, whose job it is to come and take his life, was not able to rule over him. He spoke words of Torah without interruption to such an extent that the angel of death couldn't get near him. The angel of death couldn't come into that place of righteousness and that place of life. How could he possibly have made the mistake that he was half sins? Half of everything that he did was he sinned. This person did not have time to do a sin. If the person had time to do a sin, the Malach HaMaves would have used that time to take his life. There was no time when he could have done a sin. Why? Because at every single moment he was studying Torah. Every single moment of his life, to the extent that the angel of death couldn't get a word in edgewise. He was so constantly learning and immersed in holiness that the angel of death couldn't learn his life. The story is very interesting, by the way. In the Gemara in Bava Metzia, the Rebbe has a fascinating sicha and talk explaining this whole story. Very, very profound, a very, very deep Agarata, which many of the apparently strangest stories of the Talmud end up being the deepest and the most profound stories in the Talmud. The story, in short, is that the heavenly academy and God, Mesifta Derakia, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kuchabrichu, were having an argument about a certain psak in halacha. They're having an argument about a certain matter of Jewish law, which is already very hard to understand. Well, what does that even mean? They're having an argument over a certain matter of Jewish law. God and the heavenly academy, the yeshiva shalmaila, the yeshiva in heaven, was having a disagreement with God about a matter of halacha, and they decided, it was a stalemate, so they decided, let's go take a neshama from this world, and we'll have him, or consult with a neshama from this world, and we'll have him give the psak, and they chose Rabbah. They chose this Rabbah that we're discussing, and the angel of death was not able to bring his neshama up Lamaila to make the decision between the two sides because it couldn't get near him because he wouldn't stop learning Torah. So he couldn't appear before God in the heavenly academy because he was in this world and his soul couldn't be taken because he was too busy learning. And it says the Malach HaMaves had to cause a distraction. I think it made it brought like enemy soldiers to go by where he was sitting, and he was distracted, and it was only in that moment of distraction when his mouth stopped speaking words of Torah that the Malach HaMavis was able to take his life. So this is the type of person that said, I'm, for example, an intermediate. Not a tzaddik, not the lower level of tzaddik, not the higher level of tzaddik, not the incomplete righteous man, not the completely righteous man. That guy who he couldn't die because of his constant learning Torah, that was considered a Beinoni. So obviously he considered himself, he called himself a Beinoni. So obviously,
before the term existed.
No.
Before the term of the Alter Rebbe.
What do you mean?
Well, he said
from the Gemara.
I was a Beinoni in the Gemara before the Beinoni of the Alter Rebbe existed.
Well, no, but whatever. We'll see. But I sort of understand what you're saying, but also sort of not. But it doesn't matter. The Beinoni can't possibly mean half merits and half sins. Because Rabbah would never make that mistake about himself, right? And of course, it's Mulan V'gam Pashut. We should note it's obvious. It goes without saying. So we'll say it, of course, that a holy sage's humility, right, is not about self-deception, right? In other words, you can't say, "Oh, he was just being humble," right? There's humble, but humble doesn't mean that you have any illusions about who you are. Humility isn't about lying to yourself about your greatness, right? It said Moshe Rabbeinu was the humblest man who ever walked the earth, Moses, but he knew that he spoke to God face to face, right? And the two are not a contradiction. On the contrary, that's the whole point. The whole point is that even though he knew that he spoke God face to face, he was absolutely humble, and that was his greatness, right? Is that he didn't deceive himself. He knew exactly who he was, and yet he was humble before everyone. Right? Similarly, you can't say that Rabbah called himself a Beinoni because he was deceiving himself about how wicked he was, that somehow half of his deeds were Averis. Doesn't make any sense, right? He could be humble, but the Torah humility in general is saying that the classic explanation is that if someone else was given my opportunities, they would be even greater than I was. Right, that's the classic Torah humility, right? So Rabbah, even if he was humble, would never have said, "I'm a Beinoni," right? If Beinoni means half mitzvahs, half averos, right? How do you turn half of your deeds in life into sins if you don't have any sins, right? If you don't have time to sin, it's not possible. That would be deception, not humility, right? The Eid. Furthermore, further questions. When a further question about being a Beinoni. So Beinoni can't be half righteousness and half wickedness. And we learn it from the story of Rabbah. We also learn it from the following line of reasoning. A second way we learn the same idea, which is that the Gemara says that a person who does a sin, at the moment a person does a sin, he is called completely wicked. And if afterwards he does repentance, then he is called completely righteous. In other words, as it says, as we're going to read, as we're going to see, it says on Yevamos 20a and Nida 12b and Shavuos 39b, you have all sorts of examples of people who they did one sin and the Torah calls them Rasha. The Torah says they are wicked. Right? So you couldn't be a Beinoni, half righteousness and half wickedness. The very first time you were wicked, you would already drop from being a Beinoni and become a Rasha, apparently, right? By the Talmud's usage of the term Rasha. And Tzaddik Gomer, on the other hand, the moment a person repents, whatever repentance is, which only talks about in the third part of Tanya in great length, the moment a person does tshuva, the moment a person repents, on the contrary, they're considered a tzaddik gomer, completely righteous. Where do we learn this from? We learn it from a fascinating case in Kiddushin. 49b, yeah. We learn, it's become somewhat, it's a bit disrespectful, but it's become somewhat of a joke, that if you can't find any halachic nafkamina, what's a nafkamina, Ronnie?
Initial thought.
No, that's a havamina.
Nafkamina.
Nafkamina is a yotze mimeno.
Right.
Is a nafkamina.
Yeah.
Now, if you can't find a practical, I speak Aramaic, I thought you'd understand. If you can't find a practical Ashkenazi Aramaic, right? Exactly. It's, Babylon by way of France. Anyway, so if you can't find a practical ramification for a Talmudic law, right? Because that's always the question. You have this whole debate in the Talmud, and the question is, but what difference does it make, right? There has to be a nafkamina. Nafkamina means a practical difference, right? If you side with one side, then it changes something practically. If you side with the other side, it also changes something. There's a practical ramification to this discussion, right? So if you can't find any practical ramification, there's a very open-ended case that's discussed at length in Kiddushin, in the laws of engaging or betrothing a woman to marry her, right? Where you can make a conditional betrothal. Right? And the condition can be almost anything. So you can find almost everything you can make into a nafkamina. You can make into a halachic question this way. So for example, if you betroth someone, if you say you're betrothed to me on condition that I'm rich, right? We have to understand what that means because it's a practical question. So is she betrothed to him or is she not? Or it's a practical halachic question. So we have to ask, what does rich mean when a person says rich without particular details? We have to understand what that means, right? So there's all sorts of interesting halachic questions that arise from conditional betrothal, right? You're betrothed to me, mekudeshet, on the condition that, right? So one of the conditionals discussed in the Gemara is on the condition that I'm a tzaddik gamur. You're betrothed to me on condition that I'm completely righteous, right? Is she betrothed or is she not betrothed, right? So obviously, if he's not righteous, if he's wicked, there's no betrothal. And if he's completely righteous, they're betrothed, right? Because it's conditional. The question is, what if I saw Yankel? This morning, I saw Yankel sitting out on a park bench eating big cheeseburger, right? Not kosher. Doing an avera, doing a sin. And this afternoon, I see him in the piazza, down on one knee, saying, you're betrothed to me on condition that I'm completely righteous, right? Now the question is, what's the halacha, right? And there's questions also of retroactively, right? Like if we brought this question a month from now, she doesn't like Yaakov anymore, now she likes Reuven. So the question is, was she ever betrothed, right? So the Gemara says it's a valid betrothal. Even if you saw him eating a cheeseburger this morning, it's valid mitzat safek. It's valid because there's a doubt. What's the doubt? The Gemara says maybe he had a hirhur tshuva beliboy. Maybe he had a thought of repentance in his mind, and he became completely righteous. In other words, that's how quick it is, according to the Gemara. The Gemara says it's completely possible that between when you saw him eating his cheeseburger and when he betrothed her, he had a thought of tshuva, and for these purposes, at least, apparently, for these purposes, this is enough to make him a tzaddik gamur. This is enough to make him completely righteous. So you see here many things, the power of tshuva, the speed of tshuva, right, the speed of repentance, and it's very interesting that the Alter Rebbe finds a way to bring in tshuva so early in the Tanya, even though it's not directly germane to anything. Nevertheless, it's still here. We're still talking about repentance, which is a broad theme of the whole Chassidus and of Tanya, of course, to the extent that there were thoughts initially to call Chassidus the Baal Tshuva movement in the times of the Baal Shem Tov. Instead of Chassidus, which is really a name that came from the Misnagdim, actually, originally, they thought instead of calling it Chassidim, they would be the Balei Tshuva, masters of Tshuva. The whole Chassidus is about repentance, Tshuva. Anyway, whatever. So, we see that if a person does one wicked deed, the Gemara calls him wicked. And if he repents, even the thought of repentance, the Gemara calls him completely righteous. So in other words, there's no time to be a Beinoni. How do you become an intermediate man? It can't be someone with half mitzvahs, half averas. One avera makes you a rasha, and one thought of tshuva makes you a tzaddik. So how did someone even end up halfway? It's very strange. What does an intermediate person even mean, right? What could Rabbah have been mistaking himself for to call himself a Beinoni if one thought of tshuva would make him a tzaddik and one avera would make him a rasha? Right? We see here the deepening of the question. Va'afilu, continues Alter Rebbe, even someone who violates a very light or minor prohibition of the sages, not even a mitzvah deraisa, not even one of the 613 mitzvahs, right? But a rabbinic prohibition, a minor rabbinic prohibition, Mikrei Rasha is called wicked. As it discusses in Yavamas, and in Chakrit Nida. Even someone who has the ability to protest a transgression, someone else's transgression, and doesn't protest, Nikra Rasha is called wicked. Perek Vav de Shavuos, the 6th chapter of Tractate Shavuos, right? Why va'afilu, by the way? I learned something interesting today that I didn't know before. Why does he say va'afilu, right? He says, if you violate a minor rabbinic decree...
You didn't violate it.
One second. If you violate a minor rabbinic decree, then it's called a rasha. And even someone who doesn't protest someone else violating a Torah decree, right? Not distinguishing between rabbinic and Torah, by the way, right? Which is interesting. So yeah, Ronnie's on the right track, obviously. You would say, even because it's not you who's doing the transgression, it's someone else. Although people ask, there's a question, and as you see here, how much you can be mafalpel, how much you can juice, very good, that's what I'm about to say, to get the juice out of Tanya, right? And even the Rebbe even said you could, if you can figure out how, you can even paskin halachas from Tanya. It's very precise, right? The Alter Rebbe wrote it with the precision that you could even use it for halacha. So we actually see here a somewhat halachic issue, which is that you could say, like Ronnie just said, that there's a mitzvah in the Torah, one of the 613 mitzvahs is teichech techiachas amisacha, which means you should rebuke other Jews. In other words, there's a law of the Torah that if you see someone that's going to do a transgression, you have to stop them, right? You have to protest. Which would seem to be a personal, if a person doesn't protest, that seems to be you violating a Torah commandment, which would seem to negate the va'afilu, if you understand what I'm saying, right? This is all very parenthetical, but I'm just saying, right? It would seem to be that this is worse than violating a minor rabbinic transgression. So why does the Alter Rebbe say even? And the answer is because there's a halachic distinction between someone who's sinning bezadin, someone who's sinning on purpose, on which there is a Torah, one of the 613 commandments is to stop them, stop someone who's sinning on purpose in the way that halakha prescribes, right? Whereas someone who's sinning by accident or merely through negligence, the only reason you have to warn them is not because of the Torah prohibition, but actually only because Kol Yisrael Arevim B'zeh B'zeh. It's only because if there's a general principle, not a mitzvah, which says that Jews are all guarantors for one another, you have to care for other Jews, etc. So in that case, you're not, by not protesting, you're not violating a Torah commandment, in which case this is a va'afilu, right? So you see, the Alter Rebbe is not, it's very precise, right? Yeah. Even if you don't protest someone else's transgression, so you don't even transgress. You see someone else is about to transgress through negligence, and you don't stop them, the Gemara calls such a person a rasha. In Tractate Shavuos, the Gemara calls such a person wicked. And all the more so, if a person doesn't fulfill a positive commandment, that he was able to fulfill, right? Which means it's what we call in the Gemara sheval taisa. Right? A person violates Torah not through negative action, not through eating a cheeseburger, but through not doing something they were supposed to do, right? Which is a different category because it's not, they didn't do anything wrong. It was by not doing what was expected of them, right? And what's the classic example? Right? A person who did not study Torah as much as they were meant to study. The sin of Bittul Torah, which we say later in Tanya, is a sin that almost no one escapes from. It's almost impossible to escape from this transgression because the whole idea is that if a person has any free time at all, they're supposed to use it to study Torah. Right? Since the Jew's default position is limud Torah, and if the person uses time for other things when they could be learning Torah, this is one of the transgressions that it says everyone violates almost every day, basically, right? Although apparently not the Beinoni, right? Because the person who violates this is called a rasha, right? So whatever the Beinoni is, apparently the Beinoni doesn't even waste 1 second not learning Torah.
Too.
What and Kal V'chomer at tzaddik, of course, yeah, exactly, right. And whatever a tzaddik is, it's even greater, it's even higher, more righteous than that, right.
But to some extent, then you're saying there's no time to even eat food.
No. Eating food is a mitzvah. It's sustaining one's everything that you have to do, basically. Eating and a lot of things nowadays that probably would be considered free time may also fall in that category. To consult your local rabbinic authority, right? But everything that's necessary for life, more or less, right? Eating, sleeping, etc., bathing, is all necessary. It's not considered a waste of time for not learning Torah.
Leisuring.
Leisuring is more complicated. Sha'alav Darshir Azal, Ki Dvar Hashem Bezeh. It's regarding about these people that it says because he has Ki Dvar Hashem Bezeh v'gomer kares tikares v'gomer. Because he has despised the word of the Lord, that soul shall be utterly cut off. That's talking about someone who spent 5 minutes checking the baseball score instead of studying Torah, right? Seems a bit harsh, but of course we haven't heard the Alter Rebbe's whole scheme. So hold on for that to understand how all of this works. Some people have a inclination to read Tanya harshly on purpose, which is something we will try not to do in this class, and we'll try to beat out of any students that try to do it in this class, verbally. Upshita the Mikre Rasha. And it's obvious that such a person who violates the Torah obligation to study Torah is even more wicked than someone that violates even an active rabbinic ban. The imkain akarcha Beinoni ein ba afilu avin bitul Torah. You see that the Beinoni does not have even the sin of wasting time and not learning Torah. Who does that sound like? Sound like anyone to
Rabbah.
you? Sounds like Rabbah. Rabbah, who never ceased studying Torah, so the angel of death couldn't get to him, right? We see that by necessity, by putting all of the texts together, we see that that's why Rabbah was able to make the mistake, as the Alter Rebbe is going to say. Why did Rabbah make the mistake and say that he was a Beinoni? Because it turns out a Beinoni is also someone who never stops learning Torah. A Beinoni is of that level, just like Rabbah, where they also never cease learning Torah. There's also not a moment where they would stop studying. Mishum hachita Rabbah, this is why Rabbah made his mistake, ba'atzmai about himself, loymar shu Beinoni, to say that he is intermediate. There's a footnote here. We're going to skip this. Footnote for now. We'll get back to this. Maybe do it at the beginning of next week's class. This that we say in general, right, at the simplest level, that a person with half merits and half sins and transgressions is called a Beinoni. And a person with mostly merits is called a tzaddik, who shem hamushal. This is what's called the Alter Rebbe's famous term, Shem HaMushal. It's not his original term, of course, but famous for being used in this context, is the Shem HaMushal, which means in English, a borrowed term, literally, right? In other words, what we call at the simple level, the righteous or the intermediate or the wicked, when we talk about just their external behavior, this is all a borrowed term, right? What's an example given in some of the Svarim that comment on Tanya is like when you say in a court case, right? Someone's in a court and they're found innocent, right? And you say, Yankel was innocent today. Right? We're not commenting on the inner state of his soul, that he's clean as the driven snow and purely innocent down to the very depths of his being. We just mean he was on trial, right? And he was found innocent. That's all we mean. It's only regarding his judgment, right? Similarly, the simple application of the term righteous, intermediate, and wicked in the Torah is a borrowed term used for judgment, right? We say in the Torah we follow the majority. So when you want to say the person is being judged on their behavior, they would come out either righteous, wicked, or in the middle. It means only in terms of judgment, not in terms of like what Rabbah was making the mistake about, right? That's a borrowed term used in the case of judgment, trying to determine is the person innocent or guilty or in between. Right? That's the simple meaning of those terms is only borrowed. Le'inyan schar ve'enesh, for the idea of reward and punishment. Because he's judged after the majority of his behavior. He's called the tzaddik in his judgment. He's judged to be righteous because he was found innocent in the court, right? He came out clean in the court with his majority good actions. But regarding the true adjective, the true description, tzaddik, who's actually a tzaddik? Not innocent in their judgment today. Who's actually innocent? Who's actually innocent? Who's actually innocent? Who's actually guilty, right? That's a borrowed term used in the case of judgment. That's the simple meaning of those terms is only borrowed. Le'inyan schar ve'enesh, for the idea of reward and punishment. Le'fish nadan achar rubai, because he's judged after the majority of his behavior. But regarding the true adjective, the true description, tzaddik, who's actually a tzaddik? Not innocent in their judgment today. Who's actually guilty, right? Amar Razal, tzaddikim yechatov sheftan. That's when the sages say that the tzaddikim are judged, they have the voice of the good inclination. Shenemar v'libi chalal b'kirbi, as it says about King David. King David says, my heart was void, was empty or dead. Different translations within me. She'ein la yetzahara, that King David did not have any evil inclination, did not have any temptation to do evil. All of which we'll discuss more later of what that means. Ki harga b'tainis, because he killed his evil inclination by fasting, right? Which is like by not giving in to his animal need to eat, he was able to totally destroy his evil inclination, something we'll discuss more later as well. But anyone that hasn't reached this level, where they haven't totally destroyed any desire or inclination to do wickedness, to do evil, even though his merits are more than his transgressions, they are not at all at the true level of tzaddik. A tzaddik is someone who has destroyed all inclination to do evil within themselves, like King David, right? Libi chalal b'kirbi, right? Or never had, exactly. Is not considered a tzaddik at all, meaning not the higher level tzaddik, not the lower level tzaddik. He's no level of tzaddik. And in fact, as we're going to see, usually it means he's not even a Beinoni. Usually, as we're going to see. Therefore, Amar Azal b'midrash. That's why the sages say in the midrash, Ra Kadosh Baruch Hu b'tzadikim shem mu'atim. God saw the tzadikim that they were few. Amad v'shadlan b'chol dar v'dar. He stood and he planted them in each and every generation. As it says, tzaddik in the singular, one tzaddik is the foundation of the world. In other words, the sages say, which is just another demonstration and continuation of the idea that a tzaddik can't just be someone with mostly good actions. How do we know? Because a tzaddik is very rare. It says God saw that tzaddikim are not common. A tzaddik's a very rare thing. A tzaddik like King David, who has no evil inclination whatsoever. And that's why God planted them in every generation. He spread them out so that every time has maybe one or two, right? A handful. And that's why it says, tzaddik yesod elam in the singular, right? The whole world can stand with just one tzaddik.
Yosef.
Right? Yeah, very good. Yosef is called tzaddik yesod elam. Okay, until here, it will end this week's class. Until here, we skipped the footnote, so someone will have to remind me we have to start with the footnote next week. It's not a very complicated footnote. Unlike some footnotes we'll run into, which will be whole classes probably in themselves. But the questions about the varying levels and sources about Tzaddik, Rasha, and Beinoni are until here. These are the questions. Next week, God willing, we begin to answer, which again takes about 12 chapters to get back to answer the questions, right? Next week we begin to answer, and the beginning of the answer, as we discussed today, begins with discussion of the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul, right? Which is a fascinating topic. And there's not many words left, but we'll see how many classes it takes us. It's the end of chapter 1. We'll talk about the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul. So we really, the beer in Tanya, the explanation of Tanya, the answers of the Alter Rebbe is first in next week's class. Really, in a sense, next week's class is the first class, in a sense, right? Okay. Until next week, God willing. Yes, what's your question?
I was waiting for you to finish. I'm stuck in a question.
Yeah.
The question